differently than I usually do, okay, to try to streamline it a bit. All right, so here, let me get this back on. So in other words, we're going to take some things out of order, all right? So we're going to skip ahead a little bit in the PowerPoint to this slide here about total peripheral resistance. Okay, so in the end, in order for the cardiovascular system to move blood around, there has to be a blood pressure, okay? And we'll talk about exactly why that's true. Why do we need a blood pressure in the first place when we get to autoregulation? But essentially, blood pressure is made as the heart, being a pump, pumps or pushes against the vessels that are pushing back. Okay, so probably all of you had at least a little physics in high school. So you've heard this word resistance. You know, the resistance is how a tube or a wire or something pushes back on a force. Okay? So in our cardiovascular system, the heart is the force maker. So it's pushing. But the vessels, being thin tubes, have a high resistance. You know, if you think about a drinking straw, if you chain about 3 of them together, it becomes very difficult to actually pull any fluid through that long straw. That's because of resistance. Okay, so before we can talk about the rest of cardiovascular physiology, we have to learn about this concept of total peripheral resistance. We call it total because it's the sum total of all the resistances of the cardiovascular system to the heart moving blood. Okay, so it's the sum total of lots of things. We call it peripheral because it happens not in the big vessels in the center part of the body, but in all the little vessels that are going into the capillary beds of the body. Okay, so it's most of the resistance to flow in our cardiovascular circuit is found in the periphery of the body, out in the edges. Okay, so this has just a little bit of physics in it to remind you of what you probably have learned in another class. All right. So first of all tubes resist the movement of fluid through them. Okay. Some of that is friction. You know, the walls are not perfectly smooth. Some of that is the molecules in the liquid actually are sort of tumbling around each other, and that causes a drag or resistant force tube. So we'll just take it for granted that all tubes resist the flow of fluid through them. And our vessels are, of course, tubes. Okay? So in order to actually get blood to flow, the heart has to overcome this resistance. All right? So as the heart is pushing blood through these tubes that are resisting flow, you get a pressure that builds up. That's where we get blood pressure, is that there's energy in between that pushing force and the pushing back force. Okay. So total peripheral resistance comes about because of 4 things. 3 don't change much. 1 changes all the time. Okay, so typically in physiology, we're most interested in the thing that changes, right? Because that's how the body's going to make effects. But it is important to know the other 3 causes too. All right, so the first one is vessel length. Physics says the longer the tube, the higher the resistance, okay, because you have a lot more wall to rub against. You've got a lot more distance to cover. So our vessels have a length, but that length doesn't change, at least not after we reach adulthood, right? Because we don't get much taller, and because we don't get much taller, our vessels are pretty much the same length our whole lives. So while length plays a role in total peripheral resistance, it does not change. So we can kind of safely ignore it in most things, yes.
What if you gain a lot of weight?
That can increase your vessel length because you've got vessels going to new parts of your volume. So yeah, but even that happens over time. So we kind of ignore it. All right, so that's vessel length. Another is viscosity. The thicker the fluid, the higher the resistance to flow. So if you think about water and corn syrup pushes back much more on flow than the water does. So there again, that plays a role. Blood is about 3 times as viscous as water is. But that viscosity doesn't change much, so we can safely ignore it. Now, there are instances where this viscosity matters. So let's say you've got a person who's very, very dehydrated, and their total body water is very, very low compared to where it should be. Their blood actually gets thicker because the red cells are all still there, but they're not mixed with as much water. So sometimes viscosity can matter, but most of the time it doesn't because it stays the same. Okay, so that's the second contributor. The third is turbulence. The smoother the tubes are, the less resistance there is. So for example, if you've got a pipe and then a perpendicular pipe, there's a lot of turbulence around that perpendicular bend because it's a sharp corner, right? Now, our cardiovascular system, the veins are nice and smooth, low resistance pathway. But in the arteries, you see right angles in the arteries. So our arterial system has some turbulence in it, but there again, it doesn't change. So on the day-to-day, we can safely ignore it, even though it does play a role in resistance, yes.
So you're talking more about like the path than like the inside of it, like whether or not that's smooth?
No, the part of the reason we have endothelial cells is to reduce turbulence, because it is smooth. But every time blood goes around a bend, it causes turbulence, which backtracks as resistance.
So would it be both then?
Yes, both the friction on the tube and the bend, correct. And then the fourth one is the most important because it changes, and that's vessel diameter. Okay, so physics tells us that the smaller around the tube, in other words, the smaller the diameter, the higher the resistance. And this relationship is not linear. Okay, so if you take a tube and you reduce its diameter by half, the resistance goes up by 2 to the 4th. So it goes up by 16 times. So you get this huge change for a small change. And the body uses this physics relationship to control blood flow. So the top three don't change. Vessel diameter, this is why arteries have muscle in their walls, is to change their diameter. As they change their diameter, they change the resistance of blood flowing through them, and therefore the body can direct blood to one place or another, right? So, when you're vigorously exercising, the arteries going to your intestine and stomach get much smaller. The resistance goes up, so less blood flows to those places. More blood flows out to your skeletal muscles because those vessels get larger, okay? So vessel diameter is another way of saying vasodilation or vasoconstriction, which I made a list of terms here because I get into the alphabet soup in a minute, and I know it can be confusing to relate, right? So this is worth writing down. I strongly recommend it because you're going to see these terms on other things, including exams. But one of those down here at the bottom. So vasoconstriction is vessel getting smaller. Vasodilation is vessel getting larger. Okay? So vasoconstriction increases resistance, which reduces flow, right? Because the more resistance there is, the less blood's going to flow through that vessel. Vasodilation does the opposite. Okay, so that's total peripheral resistance, and this is where it changes minute to minute, is in that vessel diameter. Okay, so one of the keys to understanding the cardiovascular system is to know a few characteristics about the whole thing, okay? So we have a heart, we have big vessels in the chest and abdomen, and then we have smaller vessels as we go out to the organs and to the peripheries of the body. So what this graph is showing you is the diameter of the vessels as you go from largest vessel, aorta, out to the capillaries, back to the veins, and back to the heart. So what do we see here? Well, this is sort of intuitive. As the vessels divide, they get smaller. So the aorta has the largest diameter. The arterioles have the smallest of the arterial diameters. The capillaries are the teeny tiniest, right? And then we come to venules, veins, and the vena cavas, and they get bigger again, right? So it's just like our transportation system is organized. You have wide streets to carry lots of traffic, and you have narrow streets to carry little bits of traffic to lots of different places. Okay, so that analogy works perfectly with the cardiovascular system. All right, so we go from big to little and back to big. All right. Of all of these 3 graphs. This is the most important one, so please star this one in your notes, because this is one that is not intuitive, I think, to how many students think, because it's a commonly missed question. And that is pressure. Okay, and I talked about this the other day, that pressure in the cardiovascular system is like a roller coaster. So the highest pressure place is in the aorta, right? Because it has received the full pushing power of the heart into it. So it's got all that cardiac pressure. And then as we go out towards the capillaries, the pressure goes down. But after the capillaries, the pressure continues to go down. Okay, so the common mistake is to think that the lowest pressure in the body is in the capillaries. No, the lowest pressures in the body are found in the vena cava on the way back to the heart. Now, there's a reason for that, and I think, we think, well, capillaries are so small and they have these tiny little thin walls, how could they possibly have much pressure in them? But they do. They have more pressure than the veins and than the vena cavas do. The reason that it evolved like that is what gets blood back to the heart after it's done its job at the capillaries is this remaining pressure difference. So the pressure at in the atria is very, very low. So even though the veins don't have much pressure, it's still enough to get blood to flow back up towards the heart, like from the feet, and into the roller coaster again, get pumped back up, and then go down. Okay, so that's an important one. And then the last graph, I think it's the last one, yes. The last graph is velocity. And again, this is just like our street system. On I-80, you go real fast, right? But on your neighborhood streets, you don't go nearly that fast. The cardiovascular system is arranged in the same way. The big vessels are high speed, okay? So like in the aorta, that's the fastest blood moving through the body. And it's because you've got a ton of blood moving through a relatively small vessel, so it's really flying through. But as we go out towards the smaller arteries and then the capillaries, there gets to be more and more streets, so to speak, so the traffic from the aorta gets spread out over lots and lots of streets, so the velocity falls. So the slowest blood in the body is found in the capillaries. Not because they're small, because if you think about it, a small vessel should have, small would resist flow in the first place, but it's also because there are so many capillaries. Oh, here, I keep losing my pointer. So you've got one aorta, but you've got millions and millions of capillaries. So that blood can take lots of different paths, so it gets this slow way down. Okay? So pressure, velocity, and then diameter of the vessels. Okay. Now, away from the PowerPoint I go, and into the fun board stuff. Okay. Because what you see here is essentially cardiovascular physiology, right? Broken down into its component pieces. Okay, so first the terms. I am going to read them all because I know my handwriting is not always perfect. CO is cardiac output, right? That's the amount of blood the heart is pushing out of itself every minute. Okay, so that's cardiac output. HR is heart rate. Stroke volume is, or SV is stroke volume. That's how much blood does the heart push out in one beat, right? We talked about that last time, end diastolic volume and end systolic volume, which are these two. End diastolic volume is the biggest the heart is, so just before it starts to contract, at the end of diastole, it's as full as it's going to be. Okay, it's got a big heart. And then the heart contracts. At the end of that contraction, at the end of systole, the end systolic volume occurs, where the heart is as small as it's going to be. Okay, so the heart has emptied as much as it can. And the difference between these, heart is full, heart is empty, is what left, and that's the stroke volume. So one way of representing stroke volume is as end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So big minus small. Okay? And there are a number of factors that affect these things, which is what most of these are. Okay, so VR that's venous return. FT is filling time. We'll talk about all these as we go. SNS is sympathetic nervous system, which hopefully you remember that from last semester. PSNS is parasympathetic nervous system. TPR, we were just talking about on the screen, total peripheral resistance. Vasoconstriction, vasodilation. BP is blood pressure. This will be a new word. AL is afterload, okay, which in your term list is directly related to diastolic blood pressure. So I'll explain afterload in a minute, but that's what that second thing means. PL is preload. Preload has everything to do with venous return. So venous return is an approximation of preload, as we'll talk about in a minute. Here's another word you'll probably have never seen, contractility. Okay, this is how vigorously does the heart contract. And then the last one is FV, which is fluid volume. That's how much fluid do you have circulating in your body at any given time, okay, because that changes. You know, first thing in the morning after the bladder has been emptied, your fluid volume is as low as it's going to probably be the rest of the day. So it does change over time. Okay, so those are the terms. Now we put them in motion. Okay, so blood pressure, that's this. Got to have blood pressure to be alive. I'll explain that later. Okay, but you have to have it. Blood pressure exists because there's cardiac output and total peripheral resistance. Okay, so you've got a heart pushing against a resistive force. You've got forces pushing in opposite directions. In between them, you have a pressure that builds up. And you actually can use multiplication to figure this out. So, you know, blood pressure, we're not going to do that math, but it's cardiac output times total peripheral resistance. Okay. So cardiac output, we'll take that piece first. Well, we can break it down. We've got a heart rate component, how fast does the heart beat? And then we've got a stroke volume component. How much blood does the heart pump out with every beat? Okay? And of course, both of those things can change. Heart rate, like we talked about last time, is affected by the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system increases heart rate. The parasympathetic nervous system decreases heart rate. Okay? Now, you could write the opposite of these two. When the sympathetic nervous system activity goes down, the heart rate also goes down, right? So the relationships are the same. Okay. And that is because of effects at the SA node. We talked about that last time. You know, the pacemaker cells slow down or speed up under the control of the autonomic nervous system. All right, so then we get into the new stuff. Okay, so stroke volume we can represent as EDV minus ESV. Biggest the heart gets, EDV. Smallest the heart gets, ESV. So how much does it push out? So there are a number of factors that affect how full the heart gets before it contracts. Okay? Probably the most important, minute to minute, is this concept of venous return or preload. Okay, so what is venous return? The heart pumps blood out, and eventually that blood makes its way back to the heart. And because our cardiovascular system is not a machine, the amount of blood that comes back to the heart changes depending upon what you're doing. Okay? So, for example, if you were to suddenly get up and start running up and down the stairs, your venous return would go up because of increased muscle activity and the veins getting smaller. Remember we talked about that auto-transfusion idea? So venous return changes for a variety of reasons. But in the end, if the venous return goes up, it means the end diastolic volume also goes up. This makes sense. The more blood that returns to the heart, the fuller the heart's going to be before it contracts, right? Because it has more blood to fill up with. And the opposite relation is also true. As venous return goes down, your end diastolic volume goes down. Now, what does that mean for stroke volume? Well, if this number goes up and this number stays the same, what happens to this number? Feel free to participate. Yes, it gets bigger, right? So as end diastolic volume goes up, and let's back up. As venous return goes up, end diastolic volume also goes up. That causes stroke volume to go up, which causes what? Cardiac output. Up, right? So an up here makes an up here, here, and here. And in the end, it's going to make what change here? Blood pressure is going to increase, right? Because these are all directly proportional relationships. Okay, so that's venous return. We also call it preload. The reason we call it preload is it's like the heart has been preloaded for an extra big contraction, right? So as venous return goes up, the heart is more loaded, so it's preloaded, we call it. And that means that the end diastolic volume is going to be bigger, stroke volume, cardiac output, blood pressure. Okay, so that's the venous return piece. Now, there are lots of things that can affect your venous return. You know, your hydration status certainly matters. So if you haven't been drinking very well, your total blood volume is going to be a little lower, which means that your venous return is going to be a little lower, your end diastolic volume, your stroke volume, your cardiac output, your blood pressure, right? So, you know, you maybe get a little lightheaded when you stand up too fast. It's probably because your fluid volume is low, so your EDV is low, and your blood pressure is a little low, or at least a little low when you stress it, like when you go from sitting to standing. Okay, so that's venous return. The other things that affect venous return, body position can do this. I think in lab you're going to do a blood pressure lab where you're going to experience some of these things. But for example, if you go into a deep squat, your venous return skyrockets because as you squish your abdomen with your abdominal muscles, all the blood in your abdomen is pushed up towards the heart, so you get this spike in venous return, which makes a big increase in cardiac output and blood pressure. We experience that as kind of a throbbing in the head for a little bit until your blood pressure restabilizes. So lots of things can affect this venous return piece. Okay, there's more though. Okay, FT, filling time, right here. The heart is not an instantaneous organ, right? It takes time to do things, just like everything else in the universe does. So as the heart rate gets faster and faster, the heart has less and less time to fill up, right? So the faster it beats, the less full it gets before it contracts, because there hasn't been enough time for it to fill up. So we can express that relationship by saying as the heart rate goes up, filling time goes down, which means the heart gets less full before it contracts. The EDV goes down, right? This is one of the limits on our cardiovascular system's performance is, you know, yes, we can increase cardiac output by increasing the heart rate, right? If the heart beats faster, cardiac output's going to go up until the heart is beating so fast that it can't fill properly. So that's when the line sort of crosses, and a further increase in heart rate doesn't result in an increase in cardiac output. So it's one of the reasons for cardiovascular conditioning is heart speed alone is not going to increase your cardiac output past a certain point because of this right here. So this also comes into play in cardiac arrhythmias. So for example, you can have a condition where your heart beats abnormally fast, 200 beats per minute, let's say. And you might think, oh, well, that's great. You know, there's going to be all that blood moving around. Nope. Because the filling time is so low, the heart barely gets to fill before it's contracting again, and it actually causes blood pressure to go down. You know, people can pass out from that kind of thing, because of reduction in filling time. Okay. And then here I just included that fluid volume, FV, total body water, so to speak, affects venous return directly. So the less fluid you have in your body, the less venous return you have, the more fluid, the greater the venous return. So for example, you know, we can put an IV in somebody's arm, and we can give a healthy person 2 extra liters of fluid in a few minutes, right? Why is that a problem? Well, as their fluid level goes up, their venous return goes up, their cardiac output goes up, and their blood pressure goes up, and now they're hypertensive until they can get that extra fluid out through their kidneys, right? So the body has a system for that, but we can jack with it, we can mess it up if we're not paying attention. Okay, so these are the factors that affect EDV. Okay, so venous return and filling time are the 2 big ones, which is also preload. Okay, so now we move over to orange. ESV, okay, so now we're at the other end of the heart cycle. This is the heart is contracted as much as it can. It has pushed as much blood out as it can. So what affects that smallest size performance? Okay, so one very big important one, the one I have in the circle, is something that is intrinsic to how our hearts evolved. And the simplest way to describe it is our hearts actually work better when they get stretched a little before they contract. And it's because of the alignment of those sarcomeres. Remember the sarcomeres from skeletal muscle? Well, in our heart, they are a little closer together than they should be for optimal performance. Which means that if we stretch the heart a little with a good preload, the sarcomeres stretch out a bit, they get more bite on each other, and they're able to contract even better. So the simplest way to state this relationship is as end diastolic volume goes up, as the heart gets bigger before it contracts, end systolic volume goes down. So it's sort of a double whammy of an effect, because now we have a bigger heart, fuller at the beginning, and it gets smaller at the end. So we get a big increase in stroke volume, because if this number goes up and this number goes down, this number gets much bigger, right? Because it's been added to by both things. Now, why do we call it that? These are the two researchers that discovered this relationship, the Frank-Starling relationship. And it's something that mechanical hearts can't do. And it makes our biologic heart an even more amazing organ, because like in exercise, for example, the Frank-Starling relationship plays a huge role. So our heart, without having to grow any new muscle, can increase cardiac output because of this relationship that starts at the sarcomeres. Okay, so as end diastolic volume goes up, end systolic volume goes down, Frank-Starling relationship. Okay, but there's more. Sympathetic nervous system can also affect how the heart contracts. So we call this contractility. The heart is not beating or is not contracting as hard as it could all the time. It has sort of like a bonus contraction strength that the sympathetic nervous system can turn on. Okay, so in that fight or flight response, or in exercise, sympathetic nervous system activity is high, so the heart actually squeezes harder with every contraction. A harder squeezing heart gets smaller, right? So because of contractility, the end systolic volume goes down, and that would cause what to happen? Stroke volume. This number stays the same, this number gets smaller. Right, it would go up, so stroke volume goes up because the heart is squeezing more out of it. So each beat is more efficient, right, because it's squeezed a little bit extra. All right, so contractility reduces end systolic volume, which increases stroke volume, cardiac output, blood pressure. Okay. Now the last one is AL, that's afterload. And this is one that's a little harder to get. So when the heart is contracting, before it can move any blood, it has to open the aortic and pulmonic valves, right? We call that isovolumetric contraction, right? It has to squeeze before the door opens. Afterload is how hard the heart has to push to get that door open. And it's directly related to diastolic blood pressure. Okay, so where to put this? So blood pressure is 120/80, right? This number is what the heart has to push against to start moving blood. Okay? So let's say we go from 120/80 to 120/100. Now the heart has to work 25% harder just to get the door open to move the blood into the circulation. So you can imagine that if it's harder to open the door, the heart isn't going to be able to push as much blood out, right, in a single contraction. So we can state that like this. As afterload goes up, the end systolic volume goes up. The heart contracts less well, right, because it's having to push against more force. So as diastolic blood pressure goes up, That's what we call afterload. And the afterload goes up, that causes the heart to not contract as well. If ESV goes up and EDV stays the same, so we have a number minus a bigger number, so we get a negative, right? We get a reduction in stroke volume, cardiac output, and blood pressure. It's one of the reasons why when you take care of patients with blood pressure problems, the bottom number is often more important than the top number is. The top number is how much work the heart has to do, but the bottom number is going to show how well it can actually do it, right? So in heart failure, for example, a lot of times they'll have a blood pressure that looks like this because the heart is not very strong, so the pressure sort of backs up and they get into an afterload problem. All right. Okay. So factors affecting cardiac output. There's a slide in your PowerPoints that goes through all the same information. I'm just doing it a little bit more my style than the book style. So questions about any of that? Yes?
Did you say that is that diastolic blood pressure?
This, yes, that diastolic blood pressure is DBP. Yes?
There's some risk factors that would cause somebody to have like issues with their diastolic blood pressure. Like that number.
Oh, there's all kinds of things. Problems with the liver can cause an increase there because blood flow basically backs up to the heart because of a pressure problem. Other things that cause increased too much blood volume. Yeah. Either from IV fluids, which is the number one cause, or transfusion that you didn't need. Those cause your diastolic blood pressure to be high too. Yeah. I can't think of others off the top of my head, but I'll think about it and tell you next time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you're stretching?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so I think the easiest way to approach all of this is in pieces. Break it down and then look at how do the different things, affect up. Okay, if this changes, that changes this, 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 and that, right? To follow them up. That's why I draw it like a tree like this. And don't think that all of these things happen just one at a time, because they don't. You have changes in venous return. At the same time, you have changes in filling time. At the same time, you have changes in contractility. So you can have lots of different variables all at the same time. Okay, so then we'll add the last piece to get to blood pressure here. So TPR is total peripheral resistance. We were just talking about that. And this one's simpler than that one is, thankfully. So we have vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Now, in truth, they're not separate things. It's one spectrum. Okay, vessels get small, that's vasoconstriction. Vessels get large, that's vasodilation. So it depends on, it's a direction, not really an absolute. But as vasoconstriction goes up, total peripheral resistance also goes up. Vessels get smaller, the heart is pushing against more resistance, so we get a higher blood pressure in the end. And the opposite is also true, that as vasodilation goes up or vasoconstriction goes down, depending on how you want to look at it, the total peripheral resistance also goes down. And this is an important bit. Most of TPR happens at the arterioles. Okay, remember there's big arteries, medium arteries, small arteries, arterioles, and then capillaries. The arterioles are what we call the resistance vessels in the body. They are the smallest tubes that have control over their size. Capillaries can't change size, but arterioles can. And not only can they do, and they do it really, really well. So at any given moment, your blood pressure is principally determined by the size of your arterioles spread all over the body. They've got hundreds of millions of them. So it's those arterioles that generate most of the resistance that results in blood pressure, the heart pushing against resistance, which causes that pressure. Okay. So all told, we've got what makes up blood pressure. Now, we still haven't addressed, though, why do we care? Why is blood pressure important? And that's where we get into this piece. Yes?
Sorry, I do have a question. Does it matter what your end diastolic volume and systolic volume is? Is there like an ideal
It's different person to person.
ratio there should be, or?
A cardiologist could probably give you a good ratio of what it could be, but I don't know what it is.
Okay.
And both are affected by the size of you and the size of your heart,
Okay.
which go together. You know, the taller the person, the larger the heart, usually because there's more work to go up and down. But I don't know what the ratio is.
So is it just
I mean, it's well above 50%. You know, so the heart gets at least 50% smaller every time it contracts.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So, you know, you're getting about half the volume out. But it's also important to note the heart is never empty either. Like, it never squeezes all the blood out of it. There's always a little bit left in the pump for next time.
So is it just like the greater the difference between the two, the higher your
That's stroke volume,
stroke
right?
volume?
And that's why that's the magic. It's the difference that matters.
So the greater the difference,
The more stroke volume you get, cardiac output, blood pressure. Good. Somebody else have? No? See. Okay. Okay. Why do we care about blood pressure? All right. So, flow. Physics again. Everybody's favorite thing, right? Things flow from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. This is not physiology, this is physics. This is how the universe works. So this is true for fluids, this is true for air, this is true for anything, okay? So, you know, the wind blows because you've got high pressure air in one place and low pressure air in another place, and the air moves from high pressure to low pressure. So this is the reason we have blood pressure, is to make flow. Without a pressure difference, there is no blood flow, okay? So the easiest place to see that in the body is at the business end. Remember I said the capillary beds are where the cardiovascular system does its job for the body. You know, the heart is the spectacle because it does all this cool stuff, but it's really the boring capillary beds are where the actual work gets done. Okay, so we take our red blood pressure number here and we bring it over into the capillary beds. And ultimately, we have this. Here's our blood pressure now. It's gone through the aorta, it's gone through the medium arteries, out through the arterioles, and now here it is coming into the capillary bed, which I've simplified into an H, right? So blood pressure here that's what that's all about, is so that we have this. Because once we have a blood pressure coming in, as long as there's a difference in pressure across the capillary bed, we'll get flow. We'll get blood flow, right? Now, the cool thing is this is auto-regulated. So capillary beds regulate themselves. They're not regulated by the nervous system. They're not regulated by the endocrine system. They control their own blood supply. This is super smart. If we had to have neural control over our hundreds of millions of capillary beds, we would need much gianter brains than we have. Okay, so this is a much simpler system that cuts down on the nervous system requirement. Okay, so how does this work? In the front of every capillary bed, there's a sphincter. A sphincter is a muscle that surrounds a tube. Okay, so the sphincter can make that tube smaller or larger as needed. And all of autoregulation can be sort of summarized in these four things. So when oxygen is low, when carbon dioxide is high, when temperature is high, we're going to talk about all these in a minute, and or, this is an and or, pH is low, that causes this sphincter to vasodilate. Okay, why is that so cool? Well, it's cool because all of these characteristics are signs of a tissue that's busy. A busy tissue needs more blood flow than a sleepy tissue does. All right, so we'll start with oxygen. This is an example. So you're at rest and you get up and you start to do some exercise. Well, in your capillaries of your muscles, as you start to exercise, your muscle cells are going to burn through oxygen faster, right? Because they're going to generate ATP. So the oxygen level in this tissue will go down. The response to that is for this sphincter to dilate, allowing more blood to flow through this capillary, bringing more oxygen, which then corrects the original problem, right? So the oxygen level goes back up. Same is true, and these are all independent. Any of these things will cause vasodilation. So a decrease in oxygen shows that as tissue needs more blood because it needs more oxygen, right? How about an increase in CO2? Well, if a tissue is busy, it's going to be producing carbon dioxide. As that level goes up, the sphincter dilates, more blood comes through, bringing not just more oxygen, which you probably need if you're making CO2, because what are you making it from? You're making it from oxygen. But also, it increases the flow that whisks away that CO2 back to the lungs, right? Okay, temperature. As a tissue, it becomes more active, it heats up, right? Because our metabolism is only about 80% efficient. We lose about 20% of our energy in heat all the time, every cell. So the busier a cell is, the more temperature it makes, the more heat it makes. So as heat goes up, sphincter dilates, more blood comes rushing through. Good idea, because you probably need oxygen. You probably need to get rid of CO2 if you're that busy. And the blood will take the heat away with it. So along comes the blood to whisk away that temperature, and the temperature goes down, right? Because it's going to carry that heat to your skin where you're going to radiate it out into the environment. And then the last one is pH. Busy tissues produce acid. Acid lowers pH, right? So as a busy tissue produces acids, pH goes down. That causes vasodilation. Blood flow comes whooshing through, whisks away that acid to the liver and the kidneys to deal with, to neutralize or to excrete. So all of these four things cause a simple change, cause the sphincter of the capillary bed to vasodilate. But what this means is it means as long as there's a blood pressure, the capillaries, all the tissues in the body will be fine, right? Because the busier they are, the more blood flow there will be through them because of the changes at the sphincter. So as long as the heart keeps up and makes blood pressure, everybody's happy. All the tissue, all the cells of the body are happy, right? So that's why blood pressure is the thing that the body pays most attention to, because without it, this whole thing breaks down, which is what happens in shock. So shock is when you don't have enough cardiac output, or you don't have enough total peripheral resistance to have a blood pressure that's high enough to feed the autoregulation of all your capillary beds. So cells start to get sick. As they get sick, they start to die, or they start to create other problems, and you get that shock scenario. Now, well, what happens when this does start to fail? Is that it? The body just gives up? No. When at the kidney, here I think I have a slide for this, which may be easier to see. Yeah, here, let's do this one. So everybody's favorite, these circle diagrams, right? So what happens when blood pressure isn't sufficient to supply all the capillary beds and tissues of the body? Well, then we get into a hormonal system that alters that. So here, we're down here. So blood pressure is falling for whatever reason. Say it's because you cut off your arm with a chainsaw and bleeding all over the place, right? So why would that matter? Well, if you're bleeding, the blood isn't coming back to your heart, right? So your venous return is going to go down because your blood's going on the floor instead of back to your right atrium. As the venous return goes down, the end diastolic volume will go down, stroke volume, cardiac output, blood pressure. So your blood pressure will start to fall because you're bleeding out. Well, what does the body do? Well, that is sensed largely by the kidney. The kidney is our blood pressure sensor, and we'll talk more about that in the renal chapter. But the kidney, because it works using blood pressure to make it function, it's our blood pressure regulator too. So when the blood pressure starts to fall, the kidney and the baroreceptors, the pressure receptors, send signals to all of the vessels to constrict. You can't see it behind the screen, but that causes total peripheral resistance to go up, and that causes blood pressure to go up, right? By that relationship, if TPR goes up, blood pressure goes up. So that helps to get the blood pressure up. But ultimately, what you have to have is you have to put fluid back in. You know, if you bled out, for example, the only way your venous return is going to get back to normal is you got to drink or maybe get some packed red cells from your local emergency room, right? So that's this system where a fall in blood pressure causes a short-term change in the heart and the vessels. That keeps you alive, right? So the vessels get smaller. The heart does as well as it can. So the heart beats faster and it beats stronger. So we get contractility, increase in heart rate. All of those things do help to increase the blood pressure. But in a hemorrhage, ultimately, you're on this path. You're going to have to replace that fluid and those blood cells that were lost. So the blood cells get made in the bone marrow, and then by a system called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, the kidney regulates your fluid balance to get you hold on to fluid and you hold on to salt until your blood volume gets back up to where it should be. All right. So questions about any of that? Because we're about out of time. So it looks like I'm going to have just a couple of topics to go over from this chapter next time too. And quite frankly, we are not going to get to all of it. So this piece, the blood loss one, shock, and change in blood flow because of exercise, those are for you to look at. They're all pretty straightforward, okay? So it's not like this mess we've been talking about today. So those we're probably not going to cover in class, but they'll still be testable material. I got to make up the time somehow. All right? Okay, the rest of this we'll talk more about next time. Because there we are, we're two